Um, as Todd said, I'm at Georgia Tech up until, and I'll talk a little bit. I spent a bunch of years at Mozilla on leave from tech, working on web stuff, and worked on web stuff before that. And I'll sort of get into a little bit about the whys and wherefores of that. So in some ways, I would divide my life up into my research life. Maybe if I included grad school, there'd be a before 1998. But at least for the talk, sort of some stuff happened before 2016, and then I was at Mozilla from 2016 through last summer when they canned the whole group, and I was planning on coming back anyway, so that worked out okay. And then I'm starting up some new things. During the latter half of that time, I did a project with Doug and Wallace. As well. Sort of kept doing a little bit of work at Georgia Tech while I was gone, but I just kept extending another year and another year and another year. So it was kind of awkward. So before I did that, so I've done a lot of mostly augmented reality stuff. So everything from an AR version of the UNC Pitt experiment with my former student, now colleague, Mary Beth Gandy, to a bunch of stuff with games, from handheld games to room scale, things like a AR version of the interactive drama Facade, and outdoor projects, the architectural visualization, all that. Things with industrial, military. We have a instrumented house in the edge of campus that we did some AR, and on, right? So kind of like any AR VR researcher, I've done a bunch of application domains. A lot of my work has primarily been in sort of understanding the experiences, but also thinking about how you make it easy for people to build and experiment with this stuff. This has become less unique and niche as the technology's gotten easier to use, because more people who aren't as willing to put up with the pain are delving into it. And of course, with Unity and all these things now, we don't need custom tools as much. But that's sort of where I came from and how I got into a lot of stuff. I actually, until I got to Mozilla, which I'll talk about in a bit, hadn't actually done very much VR, primarily just AR. I remember back in grad school, when I got to Columbia in like 91, VR was sort of taking off. And I remember thinking explicitly, it's like, I'd prefer to remain in the world and have stuff around. So this AR stuff that Steve Feiner, my advisor, had just started doing was pretty appealing. In about 2009, 2010, our sort of experimenting with tools led us to try to build some AR-based or web browsers that supported AR. And this was sort of the usual academic kind of motivation, which is we were building things over and over and over and trying to work with external partners. And it was just a real pain to have to rebuild apps and tweak apps and send them binaries. And it's like, God, it'd be nice to be able to use the web, right? Because the web is nice. We could just have stuff up on a server, they could run it and test it, and we could too. So we started this Argon project. This was a iTunes webpage for the last version we released, the fourth, thus the name, Argon 4, which is still up there, although I will admit I have no idea if it still works. I haven't run it in quite a while. We actually have an internal version of a newer version that we use now, but they're still there, right? And we got it on Android, and we did some other stuff. But this question of how we expose augmented reality through the web led me to reach out to people at Google and Mozilla and Microsoft and so on. Mozilla started to experiment with VR on the web in about 2014, 2015. And so I talked to them a bunch about, could we get AR stuff out there as well? In 2016, I took a sabbatical. I'd actually been at Georgia Tech 17 years and had never taken a break. My wife, who a few of you know as well, Beth Minot, has still never taken a sabbatical because she's always like running things. and so I finally said, fine, I'm just going to work at home and do a sabbatical. But right at the beginning of 2016, Mozilla started an emerging tech group. So Sean White, actually, who a bunch of you may know as well, got hired to lead it. And Sean and I had been talking. He was the one that introduced me to people at Mozilla. So in mid to late 2016, I ended up going there and extending my leave for another year. So I spent, in the end, I extended it and extended it, and eventually, I was part-time Mozilla, part-time Georgia Tech near the end, and then eventually came back. But if you're not familiar with Mozilla, they're the people behind Firefox. It's the main part of the company. It was founded out of Netscape. The main part of the company is really focused on the policy side and trying to ensure the internet is a global public resource, open and accessible. And that's still going on. Last year, they laid off most of emerging technology. So there was, in addition to AR and VR, there was people doing IoT and working on various enabling technologies like Rust and Servo, a new web browser, and so on. But the pandemic hit a lot of companies in a lot of different ways. So, but while there, essentially, I went there thinking about AR, but it became pretty clear that we really wanted to think about sort of the full spectrum of AR and VR. And shortly after I got there, I started really thinking about one API instead of two, and sort of got some consensus around that. And that essentially led to what's now called WebXR. The motivation really, and I think this is, to me, the reason I've been interested in the web once I got there, right? After the initial, gee, it would be nice if it was easier to build demos, motivation was to try to capture some of what makes the web unique, right? So we don't, most of us don't even think about the core features of the web that make it a thing that hasn't really gone away, even in the age of smartphones and so on. Things like platform independence. You pick your device, you pick your browser, and most web pages may work, right? Some of you older people like me probably remember things like Lynx, the web browser for ASCII terminals that more or less worked in some ways. But in the world of AR and VR, that actually sounds pretty appealing, right? Like, wouldn't it be great if somebody wrote a 3D demo, and not only does it not have to only run on an Oculus device, but it could even run on an AR device or a desktop or a phone. It might not work well, but at least I could get the gist of it, maybe. The web, the other aspect of the web that's compelling is privacy, right? The browser vendors and the W3C and other orgs, private security and privacy are like job one, right? So you run a web browser, you don't worry about clicking on a link. And the reason you don't worry about clicking on a link is because you're not installing software when you go there, right? You go there. If it's a site run by, botfarmmalware.org, chances are, if your browser and your operating system are up to date, it won't hurt you. It might, but it probably won't. And in the world of AR and VR, that's a big deal, right? So when we start thinking about wearing head-mounted displays around as we walk around in the world someday, and these displays will have eye tracking and facial expressions tracking and affect tracking and all this sort of stuff, in addition to having all these sensors that are scanning the world around us, in addition to having cameras, in addition to having all these other biometric sensing devices for you and the people around you, it's horrifying. Or if it's not horrifying to you, you should rethink your view on what's horrifying, because it's horrifying. And in terms of the kinds of stuff that companies who aren't necessarily trustworthy could gather about us, right? Like simple things like people have demonstrated that if I have an eye tracker and I create a space with pictures of attractive people of various genders and ethnicities, I can infer your sexual orientation and various other preferences just based on where you dwell in this environment, right? And it goes on and on in terms of stuff like that. Biometrics are things that we can't change if we decide that we don't like what's been captured from us. But there's all this other stuff, right? Like ad hoc social experiences that we could conceivably have, just like we can on the web. The ability to put things up and not have gatekeepers. So that actually was one of the other motivations. So this is a demo, a game that a group of masters and undergrad students made. It's called Volcano Fever. It was designed to teach proper condom use to teenagers, 13, 14-year-olds. You are trying to put a cap on the volcano in the middle of the screen. It was a little handheld AR game. And it was actually informed by a bunch of stuff that this one master's student had learned when she did an internship at the CDC in the infectious diseases group. There is zero chance we could ever get that on any app store at all, right? I mean, sex, no. Sex for teenagers, no. Blah. And so the web is this resource, and it would be great if we could use it for sort of new things as well. I don't know how many people remember GeoCities. If you don't know GeoCities, this is a scrolling image of this website, cameronsworld.net. This guy went and basically extracted the top 100 GeoCities sites and made this incredibly bizarre scrolling website with all of their content. And it's hideous, right? But it also was this kind of age of bizarre creativity. And I would actually love to see a GeoCities of VR or AR, right? Everything that goes on in the AR, VR sort of world of Steam and Oculus and so on is so polished, right? It's a shame, and it means it's really hard for an individual or a normal person, like probably any of us on this call, to create compelling content or create content that could be shared. So I would love to see stuff like this happen in VR. I don't actually have any idea what it would look like. The nice thing about web-based stuff is it's easy to integrate with all of the sort of web-based tools that you might already know how to use, whether it's 2D toolkits like React or Viz stuff or whatever. So settle on the name WebXR, X for the variable, meaning all the realities, not extended reality or anything like that. It was really fun trying to come up with the name in the context of these commercial organizations, right? Because we couldn't call it. So Google had turned AR into Google Glass. Because AR was a 2D heads-up display, Microsoft had made mixed reality for AR. And then because HoloLens was mixed reality, Magic Leap had declared, another version of reality as what they did. And so none of the words that many of us academics would normally use were acceptable to most of the companies. And so we settled on XR. But it's a really low-level API. Right now you can do AR experiences on Chrome and Android. The various standalone browsers like the Quest and Firefox Reality, you can do XR stuff on them as well. There's the original first version of the desktop VR stuff still now works. So Firefox, Chrome, Edge for the various backends. And actually HoloLens just released in the Insider Edition, if you have a HoloLens 2, the Insider Edition of their OS, the Insider Edition of Edge now has WebXR support in it. So you could do WebXR stuff on HoloLens. And hopefully that will continue. I haven't been paying too much attention to it since last summer when Mozilla laid me off because I had to teach and stuff in the fall and get back into the professor thing. But I'm actually planning on getting back involved again. So just sort of to brief history, right? So it started as WebVR, and it was these kind of devices that people cared about at the time. And it was really aimed at giving you a platform independent set of APIs that would talk to the low-level platform. So I suspect many of you have done VR programming on on a modern VR device, but they have this characteristic, right? You open a device, you every frame get the data from the sensor, the head and the hand and the views. You render using the data you're given. You hand it back. The system adjusts things using time warp or space warp or whatever. Presents it on the display, and as long as you use the rendering specifications that you were given, things kind of work out, even if you fall below frame rate, because those platform APIs will deal with latencies for you. It might not be ideal, but it'll work. And so that's what WebVR was. Just, can we give you the equivalent set of low-level APIs, but in the web? And so that's essentially what WebXR is, except now it also supports AR, right? So it supports things like HoloLens or AR in handhelds. And so it's this low-level API. And when you combine it with WebGL-based 3D graphics and various other tools for web dev, you get a pretty capable API for doing interactive 3D on the web. If you're not familiar with web-based 3D dev, so this was a snapshot, actually probably last year, of part of the 3JS grid of demos that you could go and try out. So you go to 3js.org and you can see their stuff. 3JS is probably the most widely used 3D API on the web. It's actually not my favorite. It's pretty low level and has a bunch of things that I'm not super fond of, but it's efficient, relatively efficient, small footprint, and really widely popular. There's been a bunch of attempts at declarative specifications for AR, VR, 3D. Away from the web, there was, the Web 3D stuff, VRML, all these SGML based scene descriptors. So A-Frame takes a different approach. It actually uses custom DOM elements. So this junk you see here that's a complete web page. You would go to that web page and you would see that thing in the lower right corner. It's got an HTML, head tag, body tag, a scene, a box, a sphere, all that stuff are custom DOM elements that use under the hood 3JS to render a scene in the thing. So there's, I think it's pretty obvious what's going on. It's kind of cool. It's kind of weirdly janky, but like you look at it and you're like, this is not the way you want to do 3D graphics. But it turns out to be pretty powerful. So a lot of you have probably seen Mozilla Hubs. Hubs is built on top of this, and it works pretty well. I mean, it has problems, but it works pretty well. There's other libraries as well. So I actually really like Babylon. So I'm just going to play a bit of their launch video without sound from the recent version 4.2. And so this was an open source project, but then Microsoft picked it up. So it's all written in TypeScript, which I love as a language. It's basically a static object-oriented, strongly statically typed version extension to JavaScript. But it has like lots of cool things that you would expect in a mature platform for doing 3D and VR. It's fully integrated. I'll pause it when it comes up. With WebXR now, including they've built some custom, some extensions that aren't part of WebXR entirely. So this is a very brief demo of their WebXR support on HoloLens. So they've actually got support on Oculus and on HoloLens for hands, and can render them using the experimental hand API for WebXR, and it just kind of works, right? And on and on. So it's pretty powerful. It has really nice PBR and procedural textures and all the stuff you would want. So this is all rendering real time in a web page, which is pretty cool if you're not used to that sort of thing. But of course, it goes beyond just the power graphics. you then can take this and integrate it with everything else on the web, right? So lots of integration with websites and games and junk like that. Okay. Another tool that actually is amazing is Play Canvas. So if you're more of a Unity type person, you like that style of programming and 3D dev, this is just a screenshot of Play Canvas. And if you use Unity, this should look really super familiar. And it's available on their website. So I actually, and finally, one of the nice things about the web is a guy at Mozilla wrote a WebXR emulator. If you have it installed, when you load up, when it loads, it looks to see if your browser supports WebXR. If it doesn't, it injects a fake version of WebXR in there that you can control with a little panel on the side. So you can do VR, AR development on any browser without your hardware attached, and it just sort of works cleanly. So it's kind of a cool side effect of the way the web works. I actually used Babylon, Play Canvas, the emulator, TypeScript, and everything for a 3D UI class that I taught the last two semesters, so both semesters last year. Evan Sum up at Minnesota also picked up this approach and taught a class in the fall, pretty much using the same thing. It ended up being really great during the pandemic because I basically sent all the students a VR display, either a Quest or a Windows MR display if they had a PC that would drive it. And yeah, and we had meetings and poster sessions in VR. They could share their demos and things around on the web and so on. So it worked really well. And I'd be happy to share this. Evan and I are actually going to do a tutorial at VR on this. Of course, that low-level stuff is the tip of the iceberg, right? If you want to do real things, you need all kinds of other stuff: persistence, geospatial stuff, computer vision. You need to support multi-user and all this. So this is the WebXR Device API is the first low-level thing. All this other stuff is needed. It's not there yet. Some of it is, most of it isn't. So that's all work in progress. But even beyond that, like as researchers, as people who are interested in like understanding what, how we might do interesting things with AR and VR, even if all that tech was there, it's just tech, right? It's not really solving answering the big questions. So from a web point of view, you know, questions that motivated me originally, like what is the equivalent of a blog or other kind of popular website in AR and VR? Like, am I gonna blog little bits of text as I walk down the street? I don't know. You know, how do we use this for education? There's this really huge question, that I've got sort of in two parts here. Let me see if I can get my mouse. So this question of declarative content like A-frame and accessibility are really, really big questions, right? One of the core problems with AR and VR, if we think about rolling it out for real, into real companies for real use, is accessibility. The web has a long history of accessibility APIs, so people can use screen readers and so on. Even on the web, 3D content is entirely programmatic. There's no DOM that can be walked. There's no widget hierarchy that can be walked like in apps and web pages. That is a huge problem in everything that we do 3D with, Unity, Unreal, and so on. It comes back over and over when you are using it on the web because people expect anything they go to in their web browser to be accessible because they're used to it. This came up with trying to use this stuff in conferences. Once we got past the initial, oh, we're having fun and trying it, people are like, hello, accessibility. And nobody has a real answer to that yet. Okay, so that's what I was working on at Mozilla. I was doing a lot of stuff with iOS. We released a AR browser on iOS and did a bunch of other things. But I came back, and the big thing I think for me that I got out of my time there and leading up to it and afterwards was a rekindling or a reinterest in social experiences. As I said, I hadn't really done much VR before going to Mozilla, But because of all the stuff going on with web VR and the VR side of XR, I became more interested. These are things that, except for the Microsoft image in the lower right, are multiplayer games, classrooms for classroom experiences, other kinds of social experiences that we've done over the years. I got more interest in this again because of the fact that the world is on fire and bad things are happening. With climate change, I became really interested in the last 3-4 years in the flying less movements, the question of should we even be going to academic conferences, all that sort of stuff. And so that is one of the things that I started thinking about when I was at Mozilla, and I'm still working on. So we ran a small test of remote access at WIST 2019. Did some more stuff with a few other conferences. Kyle Johnson and I ran VR 2020 and brought that online. So I'm interested in that, which I'll talk about a bit more in a sec. And also some of these other experiences and weirdly the idea of books in VR. So I'm just going to spend the rest of the talk touching on a few things that I'm interested in moving forward. And these are more thoughts and questions and less results, since I just got back and don't have any funding and I'm just starting new things. I will emphasize that I'm interested in spaces. I'm interested in the idea of, if I could put on a HoloLens and wear it all day and there was stuff around me, what would that stuff be and how would it help me get things done and make my life better in any way? If I could put on a VR display and go into VR for, an hour, 2 hours, 8 hours, what would I do in there? How would that thing be structured? How would it work? So a lot of the work that gets done in AR and VR research is looks at specific problems and how you can solve them and build them. And that's great, right? If you want to show some effect, if you want to demonstrate that it could be useful for things, that's what you do. It's just not what I'm talking about here. I'm really interested in this question of spaces and what are they really good for. There's obvious things that people are exploring. So I mentioned Hubs. So Mozilla's Hubs is a web-based social VR platform. We've used it for conferences and other things, where it uses 3JS A-Frame, WebXR, and then various common backends, the same essentially backends that we're using right now for audio and video, to create social experiences. We've used it in the lower right for teaching. I've used it for conferences. There's a pile of companies coming out with these collaborative AR, VR experiences or tools that you can pay lots of money for to help you work remotely. Spatial's one that happened to get a lot of buzz early on. They support Magic Leap and HoloLens, as well as a bunch of VR devices and desktops, to let you create these spatial information spaces that you and other people who aren't near you can go into together. Okay. Even before I went to Mozilla, I was started to become more interested in the question that comes up with those sorts of systems, which is, if we want to have an experience that is social, like social VR, but in AR, and maybe we want to have heterogeneous ones, but I was kind of interested in AR at the time. How do we deal with the question of, the problem that we have different spaces, different kinds of tables and chairs, different arrangements of space, so that 2 or 3 people who are trying to collaborate at a distance may not see each other in the same arrangement, right? Like my office is really long and thin. If I was going to have y'all in my office, you'd be sort of spread out this way. You might be sitting in a conference room someday again, and have us all around this thing. You might have a kitchen table that's different. So what that poster we had at VR 2016 was just it was the start of an exploration of, if I remap everybody so that in each space they can be in a different arrangement. And I just look to see which person you're looking at, and then remap your avatar remotely so that it looks at the appropriate one. What would that feel like? And the project I went to Mozilla right after this. The project sort of, the students went on and focused on different things, so we didn't actually get to do more of it. But I think those questions are super interesting. Even if we solve all of those problems, where does that get us? And does it get us where we want? Like, do we want to get here? Is it Ready Player One in VR and Rainbow's End? If you haven't read Rainbow's End, it's great. In AR, where we have these sort of global, massive, shared virtual worlds that we do everything in. Maybe, I don't know. I think as soon as you start thinking about that, there's all these elephants in the room that we kind of don't acknowledge or think about too much when we're thinking about these things. So the big thing is that if you want to actually use this AR and VR for real work or real social experiences or real stuff beyond using a tool together like Zoom or Spatial, the content and all of the ecosystem can't stand alone. And those of us who've tried to use VR for conferences, either with Hubs or Virbela or any of these other systems that people have tried to use, AltSpace, have seen this, right? It's like the content is outside of the VR space. It's hard to get things in. It's hard to get things out. This is not like going to go away, and we actually have to solve this to make AR and VR sort of more globally useful. And so you need to get it in, you need to get it out. And then there's other problems like avatars, right? Like right now, every platform you go to, there's no representation of self that you could import, right? Like I look differently in every system, and that may be okay, but really, I think, and I put that cat comment in there because it used to be a dog, now apparently we're cats on Zoom. Anyway, so I think there's these huge big questions that it's not our responsibility as researchers to deal with these things, right? But if we actually want to see AR and VR get out there, someone has to, and we have to think about how that might work. In some ways, those are table stakes for getting real systems. I actually think that it's this weird thing. In some ways, it feels like we're closer to having real VR systems for work than AR, just because the hardware is more pervasive and there's more things like AltSpace and VR chat and Rec Room and big screen and hubs and all these things. But as soon as you go past non-casual collaboration, I actually think AR will happen sort of at a wider scale, especially in companies and enterprise, before VR, just because of the fact that we can use other things, right? Like if we were all wearing HoloLens 3 or 4 or whatever, and we could wear it all day and so on, I wouldn't need to get everything into my AR system because I can actually use the screens and the tablets. And so I think we'll actually use AR for work sooner than VR, but I don't think either of them are going to happen significantly anytime soon. Okay, so quickly, I just want to touch on a few of the projects that a couple more projects that we're working on. So I mentioned this idea of books, like, and so what is a book, right? It could be an actual book. I'm teaching ethics this semester, which is amusing. I've never taught ethics, and or it could be an interactive narrative. It could be something like that. So my colleagues Jay and Marie and I have a book coming out at MIT Press later this year called Reality Media, and it's essentially a look at AR, VR, and other reality-based medias, and then a look at them from the viewpoint of media, not technology, right? So we have some technology in the book, but it's mostly a look at it from a media theory and media history perspective. But part of the thing that we're promised we'd deliver, and will hopefully deliver, is a companion immersive version of the book. And so not a website, like there's lots of people that have immersive websites that go along with books, but really a immersive experience that is a version of the book that you would experience in AR or in VR. And so we're working on it with things like A-Frame and by modifying things like hubs. These are screenshots from different versions of one of the experiences in the first chapter of the book. And I think it's a really interesting thing to consider. If you've read Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, which was a book on how to create comics and the history and theory of comic and visual novels done as a comic and visual novel, right? So and Scott McCloud's a comic artist. And so that's what motivated this. Like, can we actually talk about VR and AR inside of VR and AR, and is that valuable? The thing that makes this more than just the companion to me and raises interesting questions for, I hope, long-term research is the move to shared multi-user experiences. So we decided last year that we're actually going to deliver it inside a modified version of Mozilla Hubs. And so the idea would be, any of you wanted to get the book, you would go to the website, sign up, and you would get a copy of this immersive experience, which you could then share with other people, invite them inside with you, and go through the content together, annotate it, do whatever, and it's your copy of this immersive experience. And I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of interesting potential there when you think about kids and school and other kinds of things that we do with interactive experiences. So I mentioned early on academics, conferences, meetings, and in this case, thinking about those as short, intense collaborations, an hour-long meeting, hour and a half long poster session, those sorts of focused activities. So we've all experienced these this year, I think, right? And this was a screenshot from Hubs. At least two of you, I think, are in there, from the past chair gathering. People have tried to use Hubs. There's been a few conferences in Virbela. People have tried to use AltSpace here to do conferences, and they kind of work. They mostly don't. I don't know how you guys feel about the conferences you've attended this year. I was actually looking forward to it, right? I've been as I said, very excited about trying to make it possible to remotely attend meetings because of climate change and all that, but also for accessibility and so forth. And I find myself actually having gone to less than I would have otherwise. And when I do go, I haven't really been as engaged. VR, obviously, I was very engaged because I was one of the chairs. But part of it, I think, is that the technology is very, we all slapped it together, and there's sort of these two approaches that people have taken. So the Virbela approach is we're going to get all the content into this VR space, and everybody's going to go in and they're going to use the 3D thing, and they're going to attend the conference that way. Or we're going to tack on some external tools like Hubs or AltSpace for our VR social stuff, but the main part of the conference is using like chat or video, Zoom, Twitch, whatever. And both of them sort of failed, I think, in different ways. So the question that I'm thinking about right now, and what I got a couple of students starting to work on this, is if we could integrate things better. So take the traditional sort of 2D video, text chat, video chat, and add 3D in so that there's no friction, so you can really make it work together and not try to make it 3D first, right? Not try to go down the path of Virbela. Would people use it? When would they use it? Why would they use it? Would it actually work any better? So we're just starting to work on this, and I think it's going to be pretty promising. I'd be happy to chat about it. So taking that question and turning it around and saying, okay, let's not worry about these short collaborations. Let's talk about the other problem with long distance collaboration, which is the loss of casual serendipitous interaction, right? And this is a huge problem that we all are familiar with. Could we, and I'm certainly not the first person to say, could we use 3D for this? I would not be surprised if some of you are thinking about this too. For me, I've been thinking about it going back to sort of really early work, like in the media space work that Park did, and a lot of work that followed it, where because the media spaces that project at Park had a similar motivation. It's like if people were separate, and we'll do it in their offices, but if they were separate, could we use video, always on video cameras, to simulate people being closer together? Would it work? What were the effects? And they discovered all kinds of good and bad things about that, as I think a lot of you know about. If you haven't read about it, it's really interesting. And that continued at Park, right? So all the Ubicomp stuff came out of CSL in the like early 90s. So that's Mark Weiser there. If you don't know Mark, where is he? Where's my mouse? Here, who sort of created this. And they took the other approach, which was, if we could just have pervasive technology, screens and tablets and small little tabs, all of which we have now, how would that change both our co-located, they were mostly focused on co-located interactions, but they also did some distributed stuff. We actually did, here at GT, a project looking at sort of the distributed version of that, where if we could augment people's offices, in this case with big screens and projectors, and create these kind of montages of images that represent the work you were doing with someone or on a task, would we be able to use it as a way to ground collaboration and ground your ability to multitask and revisit tasks? So this was a lot of Steve Voita's PhD. He's now long since graduated. He was one of Beth's students. But that notion of sitting inside a space continuously is one of the things that I think is really interesting. And again, in all these things, all three of those projects, the idea was we're creating environments that you work inside of, as opposed to tools that you use to work, I think. So we did some of this, again, right before I left to go on sabbatical. Mark Gusdile and Betsy DeSalvo and a couple of students, PhD student Amber Solomon, asked the question, can we use an immersive environment? In this case, we use projectors all around the space. We actually use Microsoft's Room Alive toolkit and lots of Kinects up here and projectors to be able to project flat images on all the surfaces around without distortion. And we did something very simple. So this was using, this was part of the MediaComp Intro CS class, where students learn programming by manipulating pictures. So all we did was, every time they created a picture, we put it on the wall in their spot. So one of these spots corresponds to a student. And what we wanted to explore was, could we see an emergence of the kind of pedagogy you see in art studios and design studios and architecture studios in a CS studio, where if we could pull the media out of the laptop, right? Because the biggest problem with computers, anything using computers, it could be an engineering design class, is that nobody can see what anybody else is doing. And so nobody can both ask for help or get inspired or help others. And so we saw this stuff, right? People would see a picture and laugh at it, ask somebody how they did it. They would see a picture and say, oh, I had that problem. Here's how you could fix it. Or we even saw students who would say, I noticed your picture hasn't changed in like 20 minutes. Are you having a problem? And so this was great. And I think it's really indicative of the kinds of advantages we might get if we could build these sort of environments that you do work in, instead of ones that are aimed at solving tasks. And so in some ways, this goes all the way back to Hiroshi's and Brig Ulmer's work at the Media Lab, right? With ambient environments, where what they did was they did stuff like, use light and water to create water ripples on the ceiling that told you something. Used light used little objects like bottles, oops, sorry, and so on, to create this environment that ambiently had a lot of information in it while you were in it that you might attend to or you might not, and so on. And so that, I think, is an interesting sort of avenue to think about for VR, right? Like and so this is what we're sort of starting to work on now, is in this context, is if you could create VR environments that had a lot of real-time, useful ambient information for the people who are in it. So if you're a programmer on a programming team, it might be programmer related. If you're someone who does building management, it might be that related. If we could do that and build these environments, would people, and assuming we could get people to use them, so we have some people who volunteered, and if they come and pay attention, do we start to see the serendipitous interactions and relationship growth that you would see in real face-to-face interactions grow out of it? So that's sort of the other new project I'm working on. Thank you. So that's sort of those are the new things that I'm thinking about, and sort of the directions that I think are really interesting right now. So